con la siguiente mesa redonda sobre las innovaciones en el uso de software, y ellos lo tienen organizado un poco. La primera intervención va a ser de Rita Jordan, con las nuevas tecnologías para el incremento del entrenamiento en habilidades sociales y la necesidad de un acercamiento innovador. Y después Gerardo Herrera y Raquel Avellán, del Grupo de Autismo y Dificultades de Aprendizaje del Instituto de Robótica de Valencia, van a hacer dos intervenciones simultáneas, primero uno y después otros, para cerrar un poco con conclusiones. Con lo cual, como es una mesa un poco larga, pues aunque no estéis todos, vamos a empezar para que podamos ir cumpliendo el horario. En primer lugar, tiene la palabra Rita, que ya no la vamos a presentar porque yo creo que ella se va a quedar en Sevilla adoptada. y empezamos con su ponencia, que ya he comentado, entrenamiento en habilidades sociales, la necesidad de un acercamiento innovador. Nos vamos abajo y ya vamos subiendo, ¿vale?
Right. Is that okay? You can all hear? Good.
45 minutes, okay?
Okay, I'll try. Okay. So, some of this builds on what we talked a little bit about this morning and what Amy Klin also mentioned. We have to think of Asperger syndrome as a developmental disorder, because of course that is what it is. And the first thing we need to know about a developmental disorder is that it's not a list of symptoms or behaviours or characteristics. A developmental disorder means you are dealing with somebody who has lived with that condition. And that means they have found their own ways of surviving. They have found compensations. Maybe some of those compensations are not very good in the long term. But nevertheless, we need to understand what those compensations are if we are going to work effectively. For example, Amy gave an example this morning himself about what happens very often in school situations with children with Asperger syndrome. The teacher will insist on the child looking at them. Look at me when I talk to you. Why do teachers want children to look at them? Well, of course, typically it's a sign that somebody is paying attention. Now, university lecturers, of course, are trained to carry on talking whether you look or not. You can look, you can fall asleep, you can go out of the room, and we will continue talking. We are like people with Asperger syndrome in that respect. But most people want to have some feedback. They want you to look to show that you are paying attention. But then you need to ask yourself, is the child with Asperger syndrome likely to look at you to show that they are attending? Well, usually no. Because when they look at you, as Amy showed this morning, they do not get the same warm glow. They do not get the same familiar assistive impression. They very often get fear and puzzlement. And so for them to listen to you, to pay attention to you, they may need to stare at the floor, or they may need to close their eyes to block out that confusing thing. You see, if I asked you to work out some cognitive, difficult, maybe a mathematical equation in your head, you would not stare into my eyes while you do it. You would look away, or you may even close your eyes while you work out the difficult cognitive task, and then you come back and make contact. And for people with Asperger syndrome, the human face is a cognitive task. They too have to work that out. So what you are looking for really is how that child pays attention. What we need is paying attention, not looking behavior. So we need to accept what works, what is functional for this child, rather than what other children may do. And then we need to consider again, I mentioned this morning, the notion of secondary handicaps. A lot of the problems we see in Asperger syndrome don't come from the condition itself, but from the fact that it's kept the child out of the situations, like playing with other children, that they need. Or it's prevented the child from developing in particular ways because they've been obsessionally interested in one narrow thing. So again, we need to use their interest rather than just forcing them to do something which may not make sense to them. And above all, we have to remember that Asperger syndrome is a transactional disorder. And again, Amy had some slides illustrating that very well. You may not be able to tell that someone has Asperger syndrome if you're not very familiar with it when you first meet them. But when you interact, then you can easily tell. Because autism and Asperger syndrome is not something that you possess, like an illness. It is something that happens in an interaction. And if you look at the two major areas of the triad by which it's defined, if we say that people with Asperger syndrome have problems understanding us socially and emotionally, isn't it equally true that we have problems understanding them socially and emotionally? If we say they have problems communicating with us, isn't it equally true that they have problems, that we have problems communicating with them? Doesn't it depend whose perspective you take, who's got the problem? We identify it with people with Asperger syndrome. But if you talk to people with Asperger syndrome, they think it's our fault. Why don't you ever say what you mean? Why aren't you explicit? Why do you keep changing your mind? We make things very difficult for people with Asperger syndrome. Now, we have to, in a sense, if we're going to get anywhere, we have to accept that we're both responsible. That the two partners in an exchange both have responsibility for that exchange. But we already identified that people with Asperger syndrome have a difficulty, have a disadvantage. We're supposed to be the clever, adaptable ones, aren't we? So wouldn't it make sense if we were the ones who made more of the journey, who went further over the bridge to help them to meet us? And that's why it's difficult to teach people with Asperger syndrome, because we have to make the same kind of adjustments when we're teaching them as they have to when they're interacting with us. No matter how good a teacher we are, we can't do the same thing as we do with other children. We have to work at it cognitively. We can't use that intuition that Amy was talking about. And once we start doing it cognitively, we take longer and it's more difficult and tiring. But the good thing about it is that that brings us upstream. They can interact with us, but they have to learn to do so. They have to do it through cognitive processes rather than through intuition. And therefore they need longer to do it, and they will find it tiring. They need rests from doing it. However, the social problem says, is the key and are very successful in doing it. In fact, they're more successful in doing it because they do not have to join their friends down the path, because they focus on what they're interested in. So they are not very sociable. Their level of understanding is very high. Because at this time they may withdraw from people, so we have to take account of how they are at that moment. It's not clear whether they have exactly the same joint attention problem, so from what Amy Klim was saying this morning, one would think that they do, but we don't know enough about babies with Asperger syndrome. Many of them actually do manage a simple interaction when it's just two, but that tends to break down when there's more than two. So many people with Asperger syndrome can manage a dyadic interaction as long as they can dominate it to some extent, talk about their topic. So if they're talking enthusiastically about their topic to someone who's equally interested in listening, it can seem perfectly okay. But of course, once someone else joins in, then they have to share attention, and that is very hard for them to do. That's why parents often report, my child won't let us talk to each other. They think the child is jealous. Well, it's not really jealousy. It's really an inability to cope with sharing attention. And we need to actually make sure that our interactions with them, they only have to deal with one thing at a time, or they understand about how to wait and then to re-engage, which many do not. Okay. We also, of course, at the moment don't have any reliable tools, as we do with classical autism, to diagnose Asperger syndrome. So many more children with Asperger syndrome get missed or not picked up until later, primarily because their structural language is okay. And there are some often confusions with other disorders. But there's also a lot of misleading accounts of Asperger syndrome in the media. This certainly is in the UK. So people pick up wrong notions. They either think they're all criminals going around, stalking people. That's because of, one high-profile case. Or they're thought to be, much more mild than they are, in fact. In fact, even in some textbooks, you will see Asperger syndrome described as mild autism. But of course, that's to miss the point that intelligence levels and levels of autism are separate. So you can have very high levels of intelligence, but equally high levels of autism. And of course, in that group, then they are very, very clever, but their autism makes them very, very difficult to deal with. So it's certainly not true that people with Asperger syndrome are free from challenging behaviour, as I'm sure anyone who has worked or lived with someone with Asperger syndrome will know. But sadly, that label, certainly in the UK, is often enough to deny services. Sometimes in schools they don't get as much support as other children, say with an autism diagnosis, because it's assumed, because their academic skills are okay, that they don't need support. People underestimate what they need in terms of their social and emotional support. It's the same with offering respite care and short breaks to families of people with Asperger syndrome, including the children themselves. They often get denied service because social workers believe that their problems, their needs are only minor. The biggest thing that makes the biggest problem for people with Asperger syndrome is the high levels of language ability. I was in the Philippines recently, and my hosts, in fact, had a little 5-year-old with Asperger syndrome who would talk non-stop all day long. And he was particularly fascinated by numbers and buildings. So he really liked to describe buildings, you know, starting from the basement or the lower basement and going all the way up to the top, and he would go one after another through one building after another. It was his big fascination already. But because he was talking all the time, his parents found, although they were very intelligent people, but they found it very hard to understand that he had a communication problem. But I was able, luckily, to illustrate it to them because they demonstrated it very well in front of me. We were sitting at a table having a meal. This little boy was chattering away about his buildings and his numbers and so on. And then clearly he wanted a drink. And he leant across to his father's glass of water, and he dabbled his fingers in the top. And without thinking, the father passed him the glass of water. And I was able to say to his father, "What happened there? Your very verbal son wanted some water, but he wasn't using his language to tell you that. You are so used to responding to your son's needs that even though he made a very primitive gesture, you met it by passing him the water. When it comes to real functional communication, he's actually functioning at a much lower level. His language is impressive, but unless he learns to use it functionally, it'll just be like a party trick. It won't mean anything, it won't aid his development. We have to understand that that language is misleading. All the other levels, and especially his communication levels, are not as high as his structural language ability. We can still respond to his language, we can have fun with it, we can interact with him with it, but our priority has to be to make it functional, to make him understand the uses of language. Plus, of course, we often, because they become very knowledgeable about certain areas, again, we often miss the fact that their understanding of the world may be very idiosyncratic, very much their own understanding. You see, we don't have to work out how the world works by ourselves. We don't have to work out of all this booming, buzzing confusion, as James put it, what to look at and what not to look at. We are socially tutored into making the world understandable to us. You know, you hold something up to a 5-month-old baby, one of the babies that Amy was talking about this morning. You hold up the bottle and you tell the baby, "Oh, look, it's a bottle." Probably wouldn't be a bottle you choose, but there we are. It's a bottle. At 5 months old, the baby will look at the bottle. Isn't that amazing? How does the baby know, out of all the myriad of stimulation that's coming at him, how does he know to look at what you are holding up? But he does. That's what his social programming in his brain does for him. You don't have to train him to do it, the baby knows. A few months later, the baby will hold up things for you. And if you don't understand about child development, you may take them from the baby, and the baby has to snatch them back. Because it's not about giving and taking, it's about sharing attention. The root of that communicative understanding. But you see, the child with autism may have to work that out, with Asperger syndrome as well, in spite of their language. So when they come to school and the teacher holds up things and talks about them, and the child is looking somewhere else, how's he to know what the teacher is referring to? Unless the teacher tells them, "I talk about things I hold up. I talk about things I look at. I talk about things I point to." In other words, we have to make things explicit that we wouldn't have to for any other group. The problems with social interaction is, for a start, they may not be that interested. They may not find people fascinating. So then we have to try and make people fascinating, usually by getting involved with what they are interested in. I've spent time on the floor decorated in Christmas tree lights because that's the only way I could get children with Asperger syndrome to pay any attention to me. I've run, train sets over my head and down my clothing to get them interested. You use what you've got and you try and intervene in a way that helps them think of you as helpful in their interests. Somebody that can extend what they're already interested in doing, show them new ways to do it, but still within their topic. They also may miss social signals, just not find them salient. Don't pick out the human voice. My friend Ros again, she gives talks like this, and often her mother would come and collect her from the talk. And one day they're driving home in the car, and it's a typical English day, it's raining, and Ros, even though she was in her 20s then, she still likes to play with the raindrops on the window, so she's busy playing with the raindrops. And her mother starts to talk to her about how did the talk go. But she forgets something vital. She forgets the social signal that Ros has been trained to attend to. Ros, people with Asperger syndrome and autism are the only group where you have to teach them the significance of their name. You have to teach them to respond to their name. So Ros has been taught to respond to her name. But her mother forgets to use her name. She just starts talking to her. And then because Ros doesn't answer her, her mother starts to get worried and thinks maybe Ros has behaved badly at the talk. Maybe she's attacked the organizer because she has been known to do these things. So her mother then says, Ros, what have you been doing? Ros hears her name, she alerts, and she says, what? And her mother said, you're not answering my questions. And Ros said, I didn't know you were talking to me. And her mother, intelligent woman though she is, living with Ros for 25 years though she has been, still can't stop herself saying, who else did you think I was talking to? There's nobody else here. But you see, an autistic brain does not think like that. They don't know that things are directed at them unless you explicitly direct them. It's the same way, with obeying. Many children with Asperger syndrome are regarded as disobedient, non-compliant. But often we're not putting them in a position to be compliant. Ros loves trampolining, as I said this morning. So she tries to behave well when she goes trampolining because she doesn't want to be thrown out of every trampolining centre. She's been thrown out of a few. So she's in there one day, jumping up and down, loving that feeling in her body. Her teacher is rushed. They're running late, like our conference today. So she runs in, and without thinking, she says, it's time to get off now, Ros. Remember, Ros has been trained to alert to her name. Hears her name, alerts, but then the teacher doesn't say anything. So Ros goes back to bouncing. And now the teacher explodes. Look, if you're not going to get off when I tell you to get off, then you can't come in here. But you see, Ros didn't know that she was being addressed. If only the teacher had said, Ros, got her attention, and then said, time to get off, or better still, get off, then she would have obeyed, probably. She's not 100% compliant, but she probably would have obeyed. But you see, in the teacher's mind, saying, time to get off now, Ros, is the same as saying, Ros, time to get off now. I hope this is translating, because maybe word order is different in Spanish. My apologies if it isn't. But you get the message that it has to be a signal in order to get attention. Okay. And again, you may give people lessons in how to behave, but most people with Asperger syndrome, just like the rest of us, only perhaps more so, are creatures of habit. Patricia Howlin tells the story of one of the social groups she was organising for youngsters with Asperger syndrome. And in the group was a young man who was desperate to have a girlfriend. So he began to follow girls around. Now, he could learn and he could tell you that following girls around was not a good way to get a girlfriend. It was a good way to get arrested, because he'd been arrested several times. And in the group, he could actually rehearse, role play, several good ways of getting a girlfriend. He learnt how to pay compliments. Very tricky. He learnt there's a lovely lady back there wearing a beautiful blue shirt. So he might say to her, "I love the way your blue shirt matches your eyes." And that was a compliment. Unfortunately, he noticed a lady with a yellow blouse on and said, "I love the way your yellow blouse matches your teeth." That wasn't a compliment, apparently. Very hard to know which part of the body to pick, which article of clothing, which colour, you know, it is complicated. But he did his best. He tried to understand. He tried to understand how he should respond if a girl should invite him for a cup of coffee. He can say yes if he would like to spend time with her, even if he doesn't drink coffee. That the girl doesn't mean anything about coffee. She means, "I'd like to spend a little time with you." But how are they to know unless we tell them? So he learnt all these things, and he learnt, many more things, and he especially learnt that he shouldn't follow girls. He would go straight from that class where he was doing all these things beautifully out into the street, and the first girl that came along, he would follow her. Why? Because that's what he does. Habit trumps all. If we want them not to do the things, then we have to be there. I ate some lovely puddings, sweet things, at lunch. I'll step out from here. Do I look as if I need to eat sweet things? No. Don't I care about how I look? Well, that gets more difficult to answer as you get older. Being thin and wrinkly is not that much more attractive than being fat and wrinkly, to be honest. It's the wrinkly that puts people off. But even so, I would quite like to have more choice in clothes and so on. Nevertheless, I wouldn't have asked for some sweet puddings, but because they were there, I ate them. That's how I got to look like this. I eat what's in front of me. It's a habit, a bad habit, but we do it. Now, if one of you kind people had acted like a Weight Watchers lady, and as I dipped my spoon in had gone, 500 calories, then I could have gone, ugh. If I had a prompt, I could have stopped. And that's the same, especially true of social skills in Asperger syndrome. They can do it if in the real situations they have a guide, a prompt, a friend to help them go beyond their habits and to make a new thing. To expect them to override their habit on their own is not going to happen. And then, of course, anxiety may depress all those behaviours that they have learnt and they have incorporated. Nevertheless, once they are very, very anxious, they forget them all. Roz even loses the ability to speak. Now, she has very, very good vocabulary. She can speak very well, very fluently. But when she's extremely anxious, she can no longer talk. And she's actually been admitted to psychiatric care. And they, on the admission sheet, because they have not known her, they've put down that she has severe learning difficulties and is mute. Because that's how she presents. When she's severely anxious, she loses those skills. And many people with Asperger syndrome are the same. The language is often the first thing to go. So very often they need a card or something to give to people when they're in their extreme anxiety that actually says, I have Asperger syndrome and I may not when I'm very distressed, I may not be able to speak. And maybe says a few more things about them. Okay. When we talk about inclusion then in schools, we need to think about what kind of situation works. We don't get inclusion by trying to make the child with Asperger syndrome do what other children do. We have to support them to do what's best for them while working on the social aspects of inclusion. You know, if we had a blind child, you wouldn't say to the blind child, look, the educational system is geared for sighted people. It would be much easier if you could see. So we're just going to pretend you can, okay? And we're going to give you a support worker to sit by you, and they can turn the pages of the book. You know, we'd recognize that was stupid and cruel. But we do very similar things with people with Asperger syndrome. They are supposed to be in mainstream so they can mix with typically developing peers, so they can have good role models. And what do? We give them a support worker, what we call Velcro, to their side. What other child is going to play with a child that comes with their own adult? Not going to happen. You can't put an adult next to a child all day long and expect their interactions with their peers to be typical. It's not going to happen. What we have to do is to train that support worker to enable their interaction with other children, to be with the child when they have need of them, to be a support, but above all, to observe, to notice how the child is learning, to notice what is getting them upset and stressed, and to help them develop ways of dealing with it, and to work with the other children as well. It's best if we can make inclusion staged. You know, most of the successful inclusion opportunities happen first with reverse inclusion. So in an environment where the child feels safe, they know what's going on, typical peers come into that environment to work with that child. Now the child already knows about this environment, he knows how to work in this environment. All he's got to do is to learn how to work with this new child. Then that child takes him back to his mainstream class. Now the child already knows how to interact with this child. What he's got to learn to do is how to interact with him in this new environment. So it's breaking things down, but breaking things down in a meaningful way and providing a resource in that mainstream environment, which is another child. We have also resource bases in our schools, in our good schools, rather than units or classes. A resource base can physically look like a unit or a class. But the problem with having an autism class or an Asperger class attached to a mainstream is that you will have lots of variation in how bright the children are, in their interests, in their levels of functioning, in their ages. It becomes a nightmare. You cannot teach it as a class. So it becomes a kind of holding ground. And the problem is that in the mainstream, it is somewhere where they can absolve themselves of responsibility. They'll have the child in their class as long as he's not causing any trouble. If there's any difficulty, he goes back to that unit or that class. It's not the way to make progress. In a resource base, there's still the same staff, there's still a qualified teacher of those with Asperger syndrome in that resource, there's still a support assistance in that resource. But the child is a responsibility of their class teacher, their age range teacher. And the resource teacher and the age range teacher work together to plan the child's individual program, to talk about when they were going to have inclusion, how much, how they're going to manage it. And it's the only system that can be flexible enough to deal with the fact that children with Asperger syndrome don't one day belong in mainstream and another day belong in a special school or a special unit, they're variable. They can be managing in a mainstream class, but then they have a bad weekend, they have a bad night, they don't sleep, something happens, upsets them, and that day they can't manage. If you have a rigid system that allocates them here, then you are lost. Whereas if you have a resource base, it's no big deal. You can say, okay, today you will do your maths in your resource base. Tomorrow, you feel better, you do your maths in the maths class. You're back. And it's that system that can be flexible enough to respond to individual needs. Plus, many of our resource bases have things like a lot of computers, some of them even have snooker tables, and they have rules that no other children can go into that resource base unless they're invited by someone with Asperger syndrome. So suddenly the people with Asperger syndrome have a lot of what we call social capital. They're very popular, and people want to be their friends to get access to these goodies. Okay. I'll come back to that if I've got time. I've just been told I haven't got a long time. I want to talk a little bit about educational language. Because they can talk, people tend not to work on communication, sadly, with those with Asperger syndrome. But we have to think that this is a group of children who are trying to learn about communication. Okay, it's very unnerving. I'll have to do my responses as well. Okay. It knows that the signal from that intonation pattern is that we're playing the educational game. And the educational game is guess what teacher's thinking. I can't argue that it's a bottle, but that's not what I'm thinking about. That's not the answer. So it goes on. Someone says it's a water bottle, miss. And I say, yes, again. And it goes on till eventually someone remembers that we're in a science class, we've been doing a project on light, and he says, it's transparent, miss. And teacher says, yes. Now, children with autism and Asperger syndrome, we know, can hear intonation differences, because in their echoing, if they've echoed when they're stage of development, they can echo exactly. But we also know they have great difficulty in attaching meaning, as Amy Klin said this morning, to those intonation differences. So as far as they're concerned, we say yes, and we go on questioning, another yes, and we go on questioning, another yes, and it stops. As people with Asperger syndrome have said to me, how do the other people know which is the right yes? They work on the assumption maybe you have to say yes 3 times before it's the right yes. You see, they don't know how to play the educational game. They don't know how to guess what's in your head unless you tell them. So we have to help them understand what the game is. Okay, I won't go on about all the non-literal uses, just to say a word about sarcasm, because some people say teachers should not be sarcastic. I mean, I don't know how many teachers they know. Teachers couldn't live without a bit of sarcasm. It's what gets them through the day. You know, poor teachers, they need sarcasm. It's a little thing. Plus, of course, if we never use sarcasm with people with Asperger syndrome, we're not equipping them to deal with sarcasm. We can't afford to waste teaching opportunities. So we use sarcasm, but we explain it when we use it. We tell them, this is sarcastic. When I said thank you very much when you knocked all the things on the floor, I wasn't grateful. I wasn't really thanking you. You can tell by my voice that I was being sarcastic. We need to do this, otherwise how are they to learn? Okay. I'm just going to, lots of things to tell you, but I'm near the end, so I want to show you a few little videos, which is taken from a teaching video which went out to all the schools in Ireland to help them understand about Asperger syndrome in their classroom. And it shows some examples of fairly simple adaptation, but things that can make all the difference. The first one coming up, I hope. Here we go. It's about dealing with sensory panic. I can't hear the noise. I'm going to have to kill the nice man here because he promised me noise. Where's the... Have I got it turned up? I can't see. Where's the loud? Is it one of these up here? Can you hear it? See it? No, that's not it, is it? Is that it? No. Oh, that's it. That's it. I won't go anymore, thank you. Okay.
1, 3, 5.
Oh, and it's gone again. Well, you won't know what happened there, but his nice friend developed a way of working with him. And what he did was, when he asked him if he was ready, and he said yes, then he told him head up, and then he did 1, 3, 5. In other words, prime numbers, which is rather nice. Obviously, his friend likes prime numbers. But he had learned a way that was effective with him. Now, whether in time going across that floor with his friend will help him get rid of that sensation that the floor is wavy, we don't know. But at least it's a start and it enables him to move forward. Play it again, okay. Whoops. Very loud, is it?
Good sound here. Good sound?
Tommy?
Don't think we can hear it very well.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh dear. It will have to be murder. He doesn't look scared, I don't know why. He doesn't believe me.
You're right.
Okay, I will just have to tell you, it's not as good. Anyway, there we go.
Are you ready?
Are you ready?
Look up. 1, 3, 5.
Okay. And then we have a little buddy scheme. We did have.
The buddy can help protect the pupil with ASD from the hustle and bustle of school life. It is often these types of scenes that can cause panic and stress. The buddy may also choose to help the pupil with an ASD become involved in play activities by asking him to join in. The buddy can help with moving between activities, something that can pose a major challenge otherwise. However, if the pupil doesn't want to participate in a particular activity, the buddy shouldn't force him. Gentle persuasion is all that should be tried.
Even though she's such a sweet little girl, look how stressed he is. So it shows you. Okay.
The buddy can help. Here we see the assistant waiting on the periphery of the class until the teacher finishes giving direction to the pupils. The assistant immediately goes to the ASD pupil to make sure he understands the task that was set and knows what to do next. In the first instance, Christopher did not want help. In order to be as discreet as possible, the assistant spends only a small amount of time with him and moves on to the other pupils to see if they need any assistance. Meanwhile, she keeps an eye on Christopher, offering him support when necessary. The appropriate intervention of an assistant can encourage the pupil with an ASD not only to work independently, but also to ask for help.
Okay. This is even more typical, perhaps, of a lad. And notice the very discreet use of a teach schedule. Not some big laminated board, but just a little post-it note.
Next year we are going to go around to Japan on trains.
Mark's favourite subject is trains. He talks about this at every chance he gets, no matter how many times you ask him not to. It helps Mark if the teacher sets out the structure of the lesson in advance for him. She can write it on a post-it note and leave it on his desk so that he can check on it whenever he needs to.
Okay, it's 5 to 12. Mark, it's your turn to tell us now.
By providing some time in the class schedule for Mark to talk about his favourite subject, he is less likely to interrupt constantly during the class discussion.
Over the country. And next year we're going to go round on the Japan trains, and I really want to go.
And you can see not only is he happy, but the other children are not so distressed as they were before, because they know it's a short time and then it's finished. And then I think even more remarkable teacher here, same teacher, but very good.
Mark loves English, but he frequently interrupts to tell the teacher she is wrong.
You might be a very good English teacher, but you don't know much about the Revolution. It happened between 1787 and 1799.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Mark.
To help this situation in the future, the teacher tries to encourage Mark to express his thoughts in a less disruptive way.
Okay, Mark, you're very interested in the French Revolution, aren't you? And I know you know an awful lot about it. We made a mistake today, didn't we? Yeah, and you told us that we'd made that mistake, right? But what happened was when you called out, then everybody started to laugh, okay? Now, as I say, I know you know an awful lot about it, but what I want you to do, if we make a mistake like that again, would you write it in this little book? I'm going to give you this little book. This is going to be where you write the things you think we have got wrong, and at the end of class, you could come up and you and I read it together, and you can show me where we made the mistakes. Are you happy enough with that? But it means no more shouting out, okay? Where do you put it?
In the book.
You write it in the book, and you and I will talk about it later. Okay, that's great.
Although this strategy can help to maintain class discipline, it does not address the underlying deficit in social judgment.
I still think it's pretty good of the teacher, don't you? I'm going to have to stop now. I'm eating into my friends' time, so they're going to tell you about more exciting things than me. I'll tell you about teaching consequences another time. Never enough time, is there? I'll have to go. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Rita, por la excelente conferencia. Y ahora Gerardo Herrera continúa con